Please welcome David Buerge.
Thank you.
So I think that's the first time you saw that particular set of clips. Did it make you think of anything in your experience related to?
Well, I've known Cecile since 1976, and I always describe myself as a student of the Duwamish. I've served as an historian. Whenever they need what information I have, I give it. The reason why I wrote the biography of Chief Seattle, first of all, it's never been written. There's what was a children's biography of him written by Eva Greenslett Anderson in 1940-41. But other than that, the person, this is the largest city in the world named after a Native American, and there's no extant biography of the man. There are a few monographs. So I figured it was past due time. Now I had been asked to do this by Madrona Press when they started, when they were in business back in the 70s. And they asked me, would you write a biography of Chief? I said, no, of course not. It would be crazy. Why don't you ask me to write a biography of Jesus or King Arthur? There's at least primary sources there. And I didn't want to do it. But then I decided, well, no, this is certainly an interesting project, and it certainly was. But in any case, and what I've learned, that it was through that I became aware that, oh, there's actually a Duwamish tribe. This is wonderful. This was in the 1970s. And I met Cecile. So I have been working with them since that time. And one of the things I've learned is the reason why the Duwamish are not recognized is because in 1964, when Judge Bolt determined that the recognized tribes actually have rights that are established by the Treaty of Point Elliott, but the Duwamish were not grouped among those because they were, quote, a landless tribe. And the reason why they are a landless tribe, they have no reservation in their watershed, the lower Duwamish River, is because the citizens of Seattle have made sure that that's always been the case, starting in the 1850s when just before the Treaty of Point Elliott, Seattle and the Duwamish refused to go. And that was a tremendously, would have been a tremendously embarrassing thing for Isaac Stevens. So he sent people up saying, why are you refusing to go? And they said, we want a reservation in our homeland. And they said, well, we can't do it right now. We have these 4 set up. We'll talk about it later. And so Seattle and 3 headmen of the Duwamish tribe out of 20-something, the rest stayed back because they didn't feel like they were in any position to really negotiate. In any case, Seattle went to Point Elliott, which is Mukilteo, and signed the treaty. And then after that, there were actually efforts on the part of Indian agents. The superintendent of Indian Affairs after Isaac Stevens was petitioned by the Duwamish and others to develop a reservation as they had been promised, as they had thought they had been promised, as what little information we have indicates that it was exactly the case. And they thought this made sense. It was about time for the Duwamish to get a reservation because they had actually supported the Americans during the Yakima Indian War, in which Seattle was attacked. The upriver, the people on the upriver part of the Duwamish watershed did not. They actually fought the Americans, and they received a reservation. Isaac Stevens made sure that they got a reservation to keep them happy. And that became the Muckleshoot Reservation. Well, interestingly, even Indian agents were embarrassed by the fact they said, here these people fought the Americans, they have these promises fulfilled. Here are people who supported the Americans, and they're given excuses. And so they started to work to develop a reservation, probably in West Seattle, on the west bank of the Duwamish River. And when the word of that got to the white residents of Seattle, they drew up a petition. Virtually every white male in Seattle signed a petition saying this would be unjust to develop because we treat them so well. And that was sent to Arthur Denny, who was the delegate in Congress, and that put the kibosh on it. And there were several other efforts in which the hopes of the Duwamish for a reservation, the hope of Chief Seattle to have his people involved in the development of the white community, a hybrid racial community. That was his ideal. That was just done away with. So we're living out the unfortunate, the grotesque reality of those decisions made long ago. And the reason why was because in 1853, they were selling coal to San Francisco from the Black River at $30 a ton, and they had sold 300 tons. So the last thing the white residents wanted was any land withdrawn from the public domain to be given as a reservation. Yes?
The question is, where did they go? Did they join the Muppets? Is that what that's about?
No, they stayed where they had always been, and they lived for decades in with their old village sites. And a lot of settlers were happy to have them, particularly farmers, because they represented a source of labor. And so it's interesting that whites settled where there were native villages because labor, the requirement for labor. Downtown Seattle is a good example. There was a large village there. West Seattle is another example. Renton, Tukwila, all those places were, and up in the White River, there were where the farms were, that's where the Duwamish villages were. And then, but after the treaty was ratified by Congress, they had exactly 1 year to remove themselves to reservations. But still, the pressure to drive them off was building and building slowly. And by the 1870s, 1880s, there were efforts to literally drive the people off, burning their houses down, those kinds of things. And eventually many, especially when allotments, the allotment policy was put into effect, if you wanted to get land to live on the reservation, you had to sign up. So many Duwamish did that, but many Duwamish did not. And they are still there today, still living in this area today. Cecile's one of them, and about 600 of them.
Yeah, so I really want to, this is an exhaustive history, and it's fantastic to read it in its detail. I'm wondering, in the short time we have left, if you could describe a little bit about, tell us who this Chief Seattle was as a human being, as a man.
It's interesting, the very first mention of Seattle, which was in 1833, he's in his 50s. Dr. William Fraser Cholmondeley described him as a man with the face of a Roman senator, the handsomest Indian I've ever seen. Well, he was middle-aged by then. When the settlers came, he had 10 more years to live. He was a war leader. In his earlier life, he was a fearful war leader. The Hudson's Bay Company had more negative epithets associated with Chief Seattle than with any other headman that it dealt with. And Seattle had no desire to deal with white institutions other than when he had to, for trade primarily. But from the 1840s to the 1850s, he underwent a change, which is documented in the book, in which he decided, okay, if I have to choose, I will support the Americans. And he was nothing if not single-minded. So he decided to throw in his lot with the Americans. It was traditional in Native society, when you had a vigorous group coming in, the way you dealt with potential episodes of violence was you intermarried with them. And then the etiquette of kinship basically governed human relations between these two new groups. And the Native people used that same model to try to develop relationships with the Americans. And Seattle was the proponent of that. He even gave his granddaughter to David Maynard. His half-brother Curly gave his daughter to Henry Yesler. And there was a hope that they would actually build a racial hybrid. That's how they had always operated. But the Americans wanted none of that. Now, the earliest settlers, many of them, there are a few who are historically known, but the great bulk of them were basically transient males who took out homesteads or worked in mills, that sort of thing. And according to a historian of the time, Elwood Evans, 60 to 70% of white males married Native people. And these marriages lasted, they had families, and they created a society which became Washington State. But to middle-class Americans, literate from the East, that was looked upon as, they were squaw men. That was the pejorative term. They actually married these Indian squaws, and so they were less than civilized. And we have a great story in Seattle about Asa Mercer going east to get the brides to bring back to Seattle's men. Well, there were plenty of women here. They said there were no women for these men to marry. This was untrue. There were plenty of women. They were Native women. But in the terms of the literati at the time, that was racial suicide. And so we celebrate the Mercer's Maidens, and there was even a TV show, Here Come the Brides, that talked about it. But it's actually one of many examples of blatant racism in Seattle's past. The other one was, of course, the dismissal of the Native people. The Native people wanted nothing more than to participate with the Americans, and they were absolutely vital participants. During the Indian War, when the Americans were in the militia, the men marching in the militia, it was the Indians who ran the mill, who kept this place going. So that that ideal of a hybrid racial community did not happen in, let's say, in the city of Seattle, in the town of Seattle. It happened out in the rural areas, but again, we're talking when the huge influx of white settlers came in, or just white residents came in, the numbers, the percentages of the interracial unions was very, very small in comparison.
Thank you so much. I wish we could go on and on. Is there
Sure.
one last thing you would want to leave us with, a very brief summary or a brief
Seattle
one
is
thing we need to
important
know?
today. He is as important today as he ever was in his life. And the importance is his dream of a hybrid racial society. And the only reason we're entertaining these notions today is because we've changed. The Americans have changed. We've become less blatantly racist in our attitudes toward people of other races and ethnicities. So he speaks as clearly to us today as he did then. And that was the reason why the city was named after him. There's all sorts of stories that were created after the fact to try to explain things. The fact that the settlers were more than happy to name the town after him because if it were not for him, the town would not have survived. Seriously. He was the contractor that brought in the labor. He kept the peace during the native wars. It's just one of those stories where, and in the white histories that were written, they'll say, well, they used the name because it sounded nice. Well, they couldn't even pronounce it. It's pronounced Seattle. Seattle, and which sounds like Seattle, which is why I use that form in the book, but it's come out to Self, which is, there's no TH in Puget Salish. It wasn't because it sounded nice, they couldn't even pronounce it, but it was because he was such an important figure. He was a founder with every bit of stature as Henry Yesler, David and Arthur Denny, and Mary Ann Denny, and Louisa Boren.
Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That was really great to get a sense of that.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you.